In the morning of January 15, 1947, Betty Bersinger was taking her 3-year-old daughter on an errand to a shoe repair store near what's now the Crenshaw neighbourhood of Los Angeles. Weedy patches and vacant lots made up most of their view. Construction of new homes ceased during the war and had not yet resumed. As they passed an empty lot on Norton Avenue, Bersinger recalls, "I glanced to my right and saw this very dead, white body. My goodness, it was so white. It didn't look anything more than perhaps an artificial model. It was so white and separated in the middle." The scene was gruesome. The body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was lying face up and naked. Her body split in half at the waist. She was oddly posed with her hands above her head with elbows bent and legs out straight and spread apart. She had been hit over the head and pieces of flesh had been cut out. At the corners of her mouth, there were 3-inch-long slits. Her internal organs seemed untouched. The intestines that had been coming out of her torso had been tucked underneath her body. As gory as the scene was, there was no blood. It appeared as if the body had been drained and scrubbed before being placed where it was found. It had been scrubbed so hard that there were some brush bristles stuck inside parts of her wounds. Betty Bersinger went to a nearby home and called the police to report the body. After identifying the body by fingerprints with help from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Los Angeles Police Department began circulating a flyer in the hopes of getting more information. It described Elizabeth as 5 foot 6 inches, 118 pounds, black hair, green eyes, very attractive, bad lower teeth, fingernails chewed to quick. Originally from Medford, Massachusetts, Elizabeth Short moved to Hollywood in the hopes of stardom. Like many actresses, she had worked as a waitress and a cashier and had dealt with periods of unemployment as she struggled to get minor acting roles. The early 1940s marked a period post the Great Depression, which was a period of poverty and a depressed people post-war. In the early 1900s, cinema had just been invented and it took America and the world by storm, and along with it came the concept of celebrity and fame, which grew because movies could be recorded and distributed. Many people started flocking from other parts of America into Los Angeles to be part of this cinematic experience. It was common at the time for newspapers to bestow nicknames on murder cases. The papers called her the Black Dahlia, due to reports that she liked wearing sleek black clothing and had striking black hair. The autopsy on the body provided a chilling glimpse into Short's final moments. Officially, Elizabeth died of shock and cerebral hemorrhage. The marks on her legs, wrists, neck and right thigh suggested that she had been tortured. The slits at the corners of her mouth had been made while she was still alive. She had also suffered a concussion from blows to her head. Reports say that the cuts were clean, raising suspicions that someone with surgical skills may have been responsible. Forensic scientist Ray Pinker, who worked on this case, called surgeons for help. He couldn't believe that someone without a medical degree could have done this. The surgeons confirmed that the incision made corresponded to a registered procedure that was studied at medical universities in the 1930s, a hemicorporectomy. Such a cut is the only way to divide the body into 2 parts without breaking bones. Something a person without the relevant education wouldn't know how to do. Elizabeth's murder became a huge story, making page 1 headlines in Los Angeles for a full month. 9 days after the body was found, an envelope arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. It contained some of Elizabeth's belongings, including her social security card, birth certificate, photos and an address book that was missing a few pages. All the items had been cleaned of fingerprints by use of gasoline, and the envelope had been addressed using cut-out letters from movie advertisements. 13 letters were sent to the police and press, taunting them as the investigation unfolded. There were many suspects in the case. Hundreds were questioned. The police contacted about 75 men listed in the address book. The majority of them said they had met Elizabeth only briefly, but things had ended before they went any further. The Federal Bureau of Investigation investigated about 300 USC medical school students, but nothing came of this. At one point, fingerprints were found on the Dahlia letters, but they did not match with any of the ones in the database. The case went cold. Of the many suspects that were interviewed, one stood out. Dr. George HODEL. George HODEL was born in Los Angeles in 1907. He was an only child and greatly loved by the family. He was considered a prodigy almost since he was born. He was a talented pianist at the age of 9. However, his mother did not allow him to play with the other children for fear of damaging his musical fingers. When his mother passed away, George gave up music and never returned. In high school, he took an IQ test. Anyone who scores more than 140 is considered a genius. HODEL scored 186. His IQ was equal to Einstein's. It was said he managed to race through school and went to university at the age of 15. In university, one of the wives of his professors took a liking to him and started grooming him, had sexual relations with him and got pregnant. When the professor found out, George was kicked out of the university and he ended up completing his studies in a different university. At the age of 17, George decided to take up art. He began to publish a newspaper in which he wrote surrealism, the love of which he would carry throughout his whole life. He considered this movement very progressive and wrote about his search for hidden meanings within surrealist art. He wished to become a man of art and surrounded himself with all sorts of different artists. He desired to become an artist, but he did not succeed. George had many wives and many children later on. After medical school, he was employed at the Bureau of Social Hygiene. The 1930s and 1940s had numerous venereal disease cases, and as such were heavily stigmatized. Any politician or celebrity that was to be caught up in this would go to George, as he was confidential. Thus he became influential. He used the connections of these famous people to get money from them by giving them wrong diagnoses of their diseases. He also had contacts with doctors who offered illegal abortions, which also increased his influence. He was in charge of a venereal disease clinic in Los Angeles, which supposedly gave him knowledge of the sexual lives of people ranging from local sex workers to the city's elite. While he wasn't a practicing surgeon, he was reported to have breezed through medical school, where he had studied to be one. George HODEL would have had the medical training needed to produce the surgical mutilation performed on Elizabeth's body. George HODEL was rich. He had a big mansion in Los Angeles which was called the Franklin Sowden House, where he hosted many wild parties. It was built in 1926 by Lloyd Wright, son of legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright. The HODEL family lived here till 1950. The exterior of the house was strange and eerie. It was a hub for debauchery and crime. He would bring many different women here. According to a journalist who was in HODEL's circles at the time, women were tortured for sport there. Murders happened there. George HODEL was a shady bad man. So bad that he even raped his daughter, Tamar. He called it a privilege and that he would make her a woman. He could give her erotic books to read to make her a sex goddess, and that the pharaohs had sex with their daughters. He forced her to pose for photos with Man Ray naked. A year later she gave birth to a baby girl who she named Fauna HODEL and was given to a new family in Nevada. Tamar ran away from her father in 1949 and even reported him to the police. She told the police that he had tried teaching her about oral sex at the age of 11, had offered her to his friends at the age of 14, and had even forced himself on her. She had 3 witnesses. George's key witness was Tamar's own mother, Dorothy Barb, who called her daughter a pathological liar. With such words coming from the mother herself, the jury took George's side and he won the court case. George was acquitted of the charges. After leaving the court, George shook hands with some members of the jury, giving us a clue about some arrangements he had with the members of the jury. Tamar's credibility was spoiled by something else. She had told police that her father had killed Elizabeth Short. This claim only strengthened the belief that she was a liar. George HODEL had a son, Steve HODEL. After George died in 1999, Steve was clearing up his house. That was when he found a photo album. There were also 2 photos of a beautiful woman. He didn't recognize her at first. But the longer he looked at those photos, the more there was a striking resemblance to the Black Dahlia. Tamar, who was Steve's sister, called him about a week later. She mentioned that their father had been a suspect in Elizabeth Short's murder. In a bid to defend his father, Steve launched an investigation of his own. Little did he know how the investigation would go. After a little digging, Steve was confident he had found photos of Elizabeth Short. He examined the letters that were sent to the Los Angeles Police Department by the Black Dahlia murderer and found a striking resemblance to his father's handwriting. He even hired a handwriting expert to compare his father's handwriting with a second note that was sent to the Los Angeles Police Department. As he was investigating, he came across receipts his father had bought big heavy bags of concrete just before Elizabeth Short's murder. Elizabeth was carried to the crime scene in a giant bag of concrete that was strewn a few meters away from her. George drove a black 1936 Packard that looked similar to the descriptions of the black car that had been seen at dawn where Elizabeth's body was found. Steve pointed out similarities between how Elizabeth's body was found and his friend who was a surrealist artist, Man Ray. Elizabeth's arms were posed above her head, which looked like Man Ray's photograph, possessed by MoMA Minotaur. As for the slits on Elizabeth's mouth, they could have been inspired by the artist's painting, Observatory Time, The Lovers. George idolized Man Ray and wanted to be an artist himself. The expert said it was a likely match. He then went ahead and filed for a Freedom of Information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so that he could get all the files and documents on the Black Dahlia case. He realized from the documents that his father was one of the top 6 suspects in the murder of Elizabeth Short. The police had bugged George HODEL's home so they could listen to the conversations he was having and see if he could implicate himself. One day while the police were listening in, the audio equipment picked up a woman screaming. This was followed by silence and then a woman screamed again. A heavy metal object falling to the floor and blows could also be heard. Later that day there was mention of leaving no trace. Later again George says to a friend, "Realized there was nothing I could do, put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket, get a taxi, expired at 12.59. They thought there was something fishy, anyway, now they might have figured it out. Killed her." This audio text was not in relation to the Black Dahlia. It was about his secretary Ruth Spaulding, who had died a few weeks after the death of Elizabeth Short from apparent suicide. Later on, George was also recorded saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." After this, George fled to the Philippines, and shortly after his arrival, a woman ended up dead, cut into 2 just like Elizabeth. She also had a striking resemblance to Elizabeth. And George lived only half a mile away from the crime scene. George returned to the United States around 1990 and died in 1991 at the age of 91. The case is still open. The Black Dahlia murder riveted the nation and continues to fascinate sleuths today. Was the Black Dahlia merely the most infamous murder at the hands of Dr. George HODEL, or is there an answer out there lost to time? For now, the case remains unsolved.